It is really exciting that, you have to forgive my throat this morning, and my voice, but it's really exciting that we have an opportunity as a church to impact the school in our neighborhood. And Mr. Burgos could go on and on and on and tell us about all the things that we could do as a church to impact. Some of our people are tutoring, we're running family fun days, we're showing up and painting the teacher's lounge, doing a lot of things like that. And $5,000 up to $20,000 from the Hope Project, if it comes in, and it's going to come in, right?
Yes.
Seriously, I'm convinced. It's my convinced face. We're going to be able to do some incredible things. One of the things that we talked about last week was, and you'll see on this table, kind of a display for Compassion International. One of the 3 partnerships we're doing in addition to Bessie Carmichael is that our church has just entered into a partnership with United Christian Center Church in Kampala, Uganda. And so we're excited about that. We're doing it through the means of Compassion International. And one of the things, not only are we giving to them as part of this fund, but one of the things is they are depending on our church to sponsor 38 kids in Uganda. That's right. That means you. You're like, oh, everybody else. No, that's you. That is you. And so for our family, we took one home last week. Well, what's cool is that if I got the count right, between services, there are 16 of these kids left, which means that our church is already sponsoring 22 of them. That's huge. That's huge. And kind of like the offering, we have until, middle January or so. And so when the service is over, just come look at their faces, see their names. And here's what's cool. These are real people. You're not just giving, hey, I sort of hope and trust that some kids at this church get what we're sending to them. But these kids all have a name. You can see their birth dates. You can see things about their family, what they enjoy. And here's what's cool. We just found out this past week. It looks like June 11th through June 19th, we, Epic Church, are going there to United Christian Center in Kampala, Uganda. So a few things with that. Here's what's cool. On that trip, we're going to do outreach for the church and do some kids events and things like that. But we're also going to be able to see face-to-face and hold hand-to-hand the kids that we're sponsoring as a church. This is going to be a huge opportunity. And I know most of you are last-minute decision makers, so keep this in mind. If you have rollover vacation, just work the rest of this month, okay? I mean, seriously, if you're at the office on December 23rd, you're not having to do anything. Take a day off when you'll have to be doing something, all right? And keep that in mind. And also, it will be somewhat of an expensive trip. So begin just thinking about who you'll write to, who will have a heart to do this, people that are asking you, what do you want for Christmas? Just keep that in mind. But it's so exciting for me, as I told my wife last night, we have our little sponsored child, Saddam is his name, and we have him on our refrigerator. I thought, man, how incredible that in June, 6 months from now, I'm going to be able to go and meet this kid face to face. So I'm real just personally excited about it. I think it's a big deal for our church, so I'm excited about it in that regard. And man, you'll hear about a woman's place next week, but man, let's get sacrifice. And as Lindsay said, let's give generously to this team. I believe we can do a lot more than 20,000. I really do. But let's at least get there, okay? Don't make me have to call people and say, I thought my church was good enough, but we didn't bring the goods. Let's do it. Let's give generously, sacrificially, and it's going to make a huge difference in so many different people's lives. So next week, next Sunday morning, we're going to look at the response to that first Christmas, and just sort of what can we learn about how some really obscure people responded to the reality of Christmas sort of bursting forth into earth. And then December 24th, if you're anybody here Christmas Eve still? It's all right, if it's just 6 of us, I'm good with that. All right, if you're here, or you know people that will be, inviting to this Christmas Eve service. We know of families and spouses that normally don't do the church thing that are making a special exception. So make the invite. Let people know we're here. We're ready for you. It's going to be a 45-minute service, really built around Christmas carols. Short inspirational thought from the pastor, if he can come up with one. And that'll be it. All right, it'll be great. I've been told there will be candles. I can't tell you if they're real candles. That's sort of landlord code. But they will look like real candles. I can promise you that. And last week we looked at the why of Christmas, like the why of proximity. Why did God come near? What was his purpose in that? And what I want to do this morning is look at the how. So really looking at how, because how a person does something reveals a lot as much as why a person does something. So how we do what we do says a lot about us. And so I want you to open up to Luke chapter 2. If you need a Bible, raise your hand. And if someone could grab me some water, it would be awesome. Or coffee, or, whatever liquid we can get our hands on. Luke chapter 2, if you need a Bible, raise your hand. And if you receive one of the gift Bibles, it will be on page 556. Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. Christmas is 2 weeks from today. Are you ready? I don't mean like, are you ready? I mean like, have you bought your presents? And if you're not, it's too late now. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Christmas is coming 2 weeks, and so I hope that you're ready. I hope that you'll spend the next Sunday with us as well as Christmas Eve. And as you're turning to Luke chapter 2, let's stand and let's read it together as we stand. Two glasses of water.
Well, no.
One something different.
You said water or coffee?
Yeah, man. Both. Awesome. You want to read this one? Just kidding. Here we go. Luke 2, 1 through 7. It says, in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in swaddling cloths, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. You may be seated, and I pray that God will bless the reality of what we find in the story. So you have in this passage, you have some real, a lot of proper nouns. A lot of proper nouns. And sometimes when we read stuff that doesn't seem to be the main thing in a text, what we will do is kind of go, well, that's not all that relevant. It's not all that important. But in this situation, it's very, very important. In fact, I want you to see on the screen Micah 5:2, and then I'll explain the details of this passage. Micah 5:2, it says this, but you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler of Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. We said this last week, but when Jesus comes through his mother wombs and sort of enters into human reality, he's not just existing at that point. And Micah, hundreds of years before Jesus was born, what Micah is saying is the one who's coming, the one who's going to burst forth in Bethlehem, he's from of ancient times. He's not just bursting onto the scene. It's something huge for us just to understand when we think, how does the God, Father, Jesus the Son, the Holy Spirit, how does it all work? Well, here's how it works with Jesus. Jesus has always been. He's not showing up in Bethlehem for the first time. He's not being created. He's not just coming onto the scene. But Micah says something interesting, that he will be born in Bethlehem. Now, do Mary and Joseph, do they live in Bethlehem? Where do they live? Is this the pastor doing a trick question? Starts with an N, it ends with an Nazareth. Come on, help me out. Looking for a little love. They live in Nazareth, and so what I want you to see from sort of these obscure details, I wanted to increase your belief in the sovereignty of God, which means that God rules all, that God has all authority, that he rules all nations, he rules all kings, that there's nothing that happens in all of the world, and this leads to some questions, I get this, but there's not one thing that happens in all of the world, past, present, or future, that's beyond the realm of God's control. And also I want you to see that God can be trusted. The God who promises things will come about in your life is going to make sure that those things do come about in your life. So here's what God's got to do. Anybody ever faced a last minute deadline? Right? Who hasn't? Raise your hand if you've. And it's going to take a miracle to sort of get it in. Right? It's going to take absolutely a miracle for the thing to come about, for the thing to happen, for us to sort of get closure and to make our goals. So we start begging God for more hours in the day or the night. Well, here's what's interesting. As best we understand, Mary's 9 months pregnant. She's 70 to 80 miles from Bethlehem. But the prophet, from the mouth of God to his ears and out of his mouth, says the one who's coming is going to be born in Bethlehem. This has got to be a freak out moment for God, right? I mean, how can you get a pregnant woman, and you shouldn't, I'm not saying this, ladies, but how can you get her to walk a mile, much less how can you get her to go some 70 to 80 miles, the distance between Nazareth and Bethlehem? How do you get a pregnant woman to do that? Ladies, do you want to go anywhere when you're 9 months pregnant? Besides the hospital, I know. But here's the deal. God had said with his own voice, this would be how and where Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, would enter the story of human existence. So God doesn't just have to figure out a way to get them to Bethlehem. He's got to figure out a reason to get them to Bethlehem. Right? It's not like, they're not going to see the Christmas lights, all right? I mean, they're not traveling. They're not looking to go anywhere because, ladies, you can't fly when you're so many weeks and those kind of things, and you really don't need to be doing anything in certain periods of time. And so God, who's sovereign over Caesar Augustus, even though Caesar wanted to be worshipped himself as God, the God who's sovereign allows Caesar Augustus to be greedy enough to want to collect taxes at this specific time of year. And so God knows that 9 months earlier, he has to get Mary pregnant, and then he's got to figure out a way to get her to Bethlehem before she has the baby. Because here's the deal. You need to understand something. Like, Ben, how big of a deal is this? It's huge, because if Jesus doesn't come from Bethlehem, then we can't trust God. It's massive. Because if he's not right about that, what is he right about? So it's huge. He's got to figure out a way to get Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem. And the reason they go to Bethlehem is because Joseph is related to David. If you look in Matthew chapter 1, what you'll see is the lineage of Jesus Christ through the patriarchal line. And so you'll see that David shows up and then all the way down to Joseph. And so the reason they have to go to Bethlehem is because that's where they have to go register, because that's where they're from. They're descendants of David. David really, it was otherwise known as the town of David, but it's Bethlehem. And so God's sovereign. God can be trusted. And so the text tells us that they get there and there was no room for them in the inn. That's not new news to most of us. How many of us think let's not raise our hand, but a lot of people think that the innkeeper was unmerciful. The innkeeper is just doing his job. In fact, I want you to see in a moment, he was quite merciful. Anyone ever try to get a last-second hotel room on New Year's Eve in Times Square? What are the chances? Well, the reason the inn was full, it wasn't just sort of like what God does all throughout the Bible and even in our lives, he weaves things together. So he takes the common and weaves it with the uncommon, right? It's common for the inn to be full because everyone's come back to register. Wouldn't that be the worst if there was a day every year that we all had to go back to our hometown? Like, maybe you're from a cool hometown. And my dad's probably watching, so Dad, I totally agree. We are from a cool hometown. But wouldn't that be the worst if you had to show up and sort of all the people that you haven't spoken to since high school, they had to come too? Or you're like, oh, you never even left. And so that's what happens. That's why the inn is full, because everyone's come back to Bethlehem. There's no mystery there, but what God does, he takes the common, he weaves it with the uncommon. He takes the usual and he weaves it with the unusual. Like the virgin part is kind of unusual, right? But babies come through the mother's womb. That's how this baby's going to do it, pretty common. He takes the ordinary, weaves it, fuses it with the extraordinary. And that's sort of all that you have in this Christmas story. So I can only imagine, guys, how many of you guys are sort of like real men? That's amazing. That's incredible. Not a hand on this side of the room. You're like serving pastors asking rhetorical questions again. So, like, guys, just put on your best sort of if you put your best foot forward, it's the first baby, so just keep that in mind. That's a big, big deal. And you come to the inn hoping that there's room there. You find out there's no room. Now, guys, what are you going to do? Not rhetorical. What are you going to do, guys? Ladies, we're coming after you next. Yeah, we're going to find a place. This won't work. My wife is pregnant, and they don't know at the moment that they're checking in. The baby's coming, but my wife is pregnant. I've got to find a place. But women, after traveling for that long, he said, I've got a stable inside the cave. What did at least did Mary say? I know, Joseph, we'll take it. We'll take it. Now, how many of you women, ladies, when you're pregnant, or now that you are pregnant, crave some strange things? Or those of you that might be pregnant in the future, let's just enlarge the pool a little bit. What do you imagine that you'll crave one day? Any weird cravings? Seriously? Pickles. Do you like them now regularly? No, just for that time. Well, out of all the weird cravings that you ladies could have, I don't anticipate any of you would ever crave as you're about to deliver. I don't think any of you are craving the sounds and the smells of livestock, right? See, the way this worked, the reason they end up in the stable, which is most likely in a cave that's sort of on the end of the end, the reason they end up there is not that just had this open space, but the animals of the guests who were actually staying, who got the rooms before Mary and Joseph got the rooms, their animals are the ones that are tied out inside in the stable in the cave. And so imagine as Mary's about to give birth, the smells, ladies. Men? I mean, guys, there's enough in the delivery room for us to pass out without all the smells of the animals, right? And the ladies are like, I can't believe you're giving mercy to the guys right here. There's enough, but just imagine, that's the setting. That's how Jesus comes into being in his human form. You and I, all the times in our lives, very frequently at least, we're always making first impressions, right? We're meeting new potential clients. We're meeting new co-workers. We are the new co-worker, right? And so when even as a church, we're always making first impressions. So every single Sunday, there are first-time guests, even in the service right now. And when we have an opportunity, it's why we try to greet you on the street, try to make the weird, awkward elevator thing work well for you. It's why we have the signage that we do. It's why we take time in praying through and planning, hopefully, excellent worship services. It's why we do the follow-up. We as a church believe that first impressions are huge, and they are in every realm of life. Like, think about it when you're applying for a job. Like, you might be lazy later on after you get the job, but not for that job, right? Your boss is going to be like, man, they showed up 30 minutes early for their interview, and they've never shown up early yet. I mean, but we bring our best. Like, guys, if you have that one suit, right? Guys, anybody else besides me have that one suit? You're like, man, I don't know how many Twinkies I've eaten since the last time I wore it. But we're just going to have to suck it in and go for it, because it's my one suit. You know, unless you're doing a tech startup company, then you got your holy jeans and the hoodie and that whole thing. But we bring our best to the table, right? Like, you never give reference names of people that are going to talk about how bad you were and how they had to fire you, right? Like, you make sure that those people can't be found. Right? Because we always put our best foot forward. The same thing in a dating relationship, right? Like, guys, if you're clean shaven and you don't have a beard, even though you're going to be scruffy the rest of the relationship, right, ladies? You're clean shaven that first day, right? I mean, you go through you may hit a hole in the wall later in the relationship, but not the first time. Right, ladies? Of course, some of you are like, no, man, I don't do that. Yeah, and you're wondering why you never get a second date. It's protocol. Guys, you're sitting around at night going, I've had 25 first dates this year. Not a single second date. Man, it's first impressions. It matters, right, girls? But in those situations, we do things. We want to bring our best to the table. In a job situation, we want to bring our greatest accomplishments. We want to sort of have our best foot forward. We want to have the other person have this great image of who we are and everything that we've got. Every accomplishment, right? We lay it out on the resume. And so the potential boss is going like, tell me why you wrote here that you were always picked first in 4th grade kickball. I mean, we're bringing our best to the table. Well, here's what happens in this passage. God gets one chance to make him first impression as a human. One. This is his time to shine. This is his time in the moment. This is God coming into human form. He gets one first impression, and this is how he does it. What in the world? I mean, if we think we have a little bit to bring to the table, he's got just a little bit more, right? And this is how he enters. This is how he makes his first impression. As far as we know from the text and so many other texts in scriptures, there's no one there. The people just down the hall, just a few spaces over in the inn, the only thing they know that's going on in that stable is hopefully their animals are being fed. They have no clue. There's no heads of state. There's no royalty. Here's how the author Ken Geyer talks about this moment in the first impression. It'll be on the screen. He says, and so with barely a ripple of notice, God stepped into the warm lake of humanity. Without protocol and without pretension. Where you would have expected angels, there were only flies. Where you would have expected heads of state, there were only donkeys. A few haltered cows, a nervous ball of sheep, a tethered camel, and a furtive scurry of curious barn mice. That's it. Like there's no great messengers in this moment. They're coming. I know the story. This is how he enters. This is how he shows up. This is how he reveals himself. This is how he makes himself known. This is sort of his grand announcement. This is his great way of doing it. And Joseph is from this town, and yet he doesn't even have any relatives there. But I don't think being born in a stable inside a cave, most likely, I don't think that's the most humbling thing about this. I think God allowing himself to be born at all is the most humbling thing about this. I mean, is there anyone more dependent than a newborn baby? Moms? Dads? People who have ever flown with one? We're going to get you singles. We know how you look at us on those airplanes. We got it. You'll be there one day. There's no one more dependent. It doesn't say when Jesus came out, he wrapped himself in swaddling cloths, right? He can't even hold his head up unless Mary and Joseph hold it up for him. He's not feeding himself. He's not cleaning himself. Utterly, totally dependent. This is how God enters into human existence. Think of the irony. That little hand that can barely grasp his mom or dad's finger. The scriptures tell us in other places that that's the hand that made the world. It tells us in another spot that those are the hands that hold this whole thing together. Imagine that little heart inside his small frame body, maybe 6 pounds, 7, 8 pounds. I know some of you have gone bigger than that. That little heart is pumping blood to the rest of his little small body. But the scriptures say that one day that blood is going to be poured out and shed for you and I. In fact, it says that without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. He must nurse from his mother to get the nutrients that he needs so that he doesn't starve, so that he grows in an appropriate fashion. And the one who must be attached, not just out of the womb, but in the womb. That's what the umbilical cord's all about, right? You're so dependent, the child in the womb is so dependent upon his mom or her mom that they're attached. That's how they get nutrients back and forth. He's got to be attached to her when he comes out of the womb. Like dependent upon her for nourishment so he doesn't starve. And yet, he would be the one that would be able to later on nourish our souls in a way that no one else ever has or ever will. He would be the one to nourish us with love and grace and mercy and hope and joy and peace. And another thing, newborns don't go anywhere they're not taken, do they? At least initially, newborns don't travel by themselves. Some of you singles and unmarried, or ones without kids, are going, I don't know, do they? They don't. When they're first born, they're sort of dependent. They can't move, and so they start their scooting / crawling and walking one day. And so it's amazing that when Jesus, he enters in a way that the only way he can go anywhere, he's got to be carried. And yet the reality was coming that if we were ever going to go to a place where we were back in fellowship with God, he would have to carry us. So ironic. So incredibly ironic. But here's what you need to know. This isn't just how Jesus enters the world. He's not just a humble baby and then he grows out of that. Look at Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 8. See, this isn't telling us just something about Jesus as a baby. It's telling us something about Jesus, period. Philippians 2, 6-8, it's talking about Jesus, and Paul writes these words, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So what we're learning this morning does it have something to do with Christmas? Absolutely, but it's about more than just this baby Jesus being humble. Jesus was humble, period. And one thing we need to know this morning, and hear this, if you have a different understanding, I want to lay this out for you. Jesus' humility was not forced humility. Jesus' humility, if we can get that passage back on from Philippians 2. Jesus' humility was not forced humility. Verse 7. Who made Jesus nothing? Who? Himself. It didn't play out this way for Jesus because someone demanded it. It wasn't a government saying, although you're like, well, Ben, what about the bad guys that killed Jesus? Well, Scripture tells us that if Jesus wanted to rescue himself in that moment, he could call hundreds of thousands of angels and do it at once. He made himself nothing. He's not being forced into humility. He made himself nothing. He chose it. Sometimes you and I get forced into humility, right? Like we bring our work to the boss and he's like, well, you basically are terrible because so-and-so did a lot better. That's a humble moment, isn't it? Or if you ever heard growing up, why can't you be like your brother or sister? That's a humble moment. No one forces humility on Jesus. In fact, I would say the two most humbling acts in all of history that ever was and that ever will be. One, the day that Jesus enters into human form, his birth. But two, the day that Jesus exits human form, his death. Scripture tells us in verse 8 that he becomes obedient to death, even death on a cross. So when people go, well, I don't know, it seems like people killed Jesus to me. They did. They did. Only because he let them. Why did he let them? Because this had been God's plan all along. That's why we can't talk about Christmas without getting to Easter. This baby's not coming just to be a cute little boy. He's not coming to be a grown-up good teacher. He's coming to ransom his people. He's coming to be the Savior of the world. That's who he is. Now here's what's crazy. When it comes to entitlement, we think we're entitled to a lot, don't we? Some of you are feeling a little bit prideful right now, and you're thinking, no, not me. Let's play this out, okay? Let's say for Christmas this year, if your parents are alive, even if you're 50 in the room, okay? Let's say you go home for Christmas and your mom and dad don't give you anything. Show me your public reaction first. Like you're at the dinner table. Public is all I want to see. Now show me what you're doing behind the closed doors with your spouse or friend. Getting your phone out, texting your friend like, I can't believe. Because why? Because you feel entitled. I do too. We're not entitled to anything, and yet we believe that the things that we have and even the things we don't have, we deserve, that we're entitled to those things. So though we aren't entitled, basically we come into the world with nothing, right? We don't really bring anything to the table that entitles us for the kind of things that God lovingly pours out to us. And though we are not entitled, we live as though we're entitled. Here's what's crazy. Though Jesus had complete entitlement, he lived as though he had none. Listen to that again. We live as though we're entitled to everything. And we don't have any entitlement. Jesus had all entitlement. But you never would have known it by the way he lived his life. You never would have known it by the way Christmas comes to earth. You never would have known it by the way he leaves this life. The scriptures say to us that he had all entitlement to come down from the cross to remove himself. But it was about more than entitlement to him. And this morning, in a moment, we're going to receive communion. We're going to take the bread that represents his body. We're going to dip it in the cup where the juice represents his blood. And we're going to feast on Jesus. We're going to receive him symbolically as we do so in our hearts in reality. And here's what's cool. Epic Church isn't inviting you to the table this morning. Jesus is. But Jesus isn't inviting you to the table because you're entitled to the table. Jesus isn't inviting you or me to the table because we're really good religious people. He's not inviting us to the table because you know a lot of Bible verses. He's not inviting us to the table because you haven't messed up in a major sin, at least in over a year. That's not why you're coming to the table. You're coming to the table because the one who has entitlement has invited you in. He's made you worthy. He's made you righteous. But only those of us will partake of this table if we receive the grace and mercy and love and forgiveness that Jesus offers us. He came to take our sin, to take it away, to take the punishment for it, so that God might be restored, and we ultimately might be restored into proper relationship with God through Jesus. So if you've never made your decision to really place your faith in Jesus, maybe your faith's in your good works, maybe your faith's in the fact that your parents are Christians, maybe your faith's in the fact that you're going to give some money to the Hope Project. None of those things cut it. Placing your faith in Jesus for what He's done on your behalf is what restores us into relationship with Him. We repent of our sin and go, you know what, God, I've walked away from you. I've missed the mark. I need to be restored, and you've sent Jesus so that we might be made right. That's available for you this morning. If you are a Christian this morning, before we receive communion, will you take time just to contemplate? Where's your heart? Don't do this flippantly. Where's your heart? You've been going through religious motions. Have you been checking off, hey, at church? Maybe you need to do some sort of inspection in your heart and reflection on where you and God are. Has God revealed things to you and you've sort of dismissed them? Has God brought up something you need to do and you sort of just pushed it aside? Let's confess our sins. Let's come to the table with the right heart and right spirit. Not about perfection, but it is about fellowship. That's what the table's all about. Let me pray for us, and then Brett and the band will lead us in a couple songs, and we'll stand and sing, you can sit and pray, and then we'll form a line down this aisle and around to receive communion. There'll be 2 songs, plenty of time to do that. Let's embrace what God's doing and offering us this table this morning. God, I thank you that you didn't come in the world like I would have if I had your credentials. God, I never would have imagined in 1,000 years that you would enter this way. But God, what you are pronouncing to us is that there's space for us. Jesus, I thank you that you've come to personally restore me into a relationship with God the Father. Jesus, I thank you that you bore the weight of our sin and the punishment of it so that we could have fellowship at this table and for eternity. Oh God, I pray as we enter the season deeper and deeper, as we head towards Christmas, God, would you change lives in this room? God, would you convince those that are skeptical? God, would you show them that you came for them and you weren't just telling them to clean themselves up and get to you, but while they were and while I was still a sinner, you sent Jesus for us. We're not entitled to anything we receive from you, God, but yet you still invite us. May we receive well this morning in Jesus' name.